Extreme weather and the climate crisis. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Heat waves, tropical storms, wildfires, record high temperatures and deaths. This summer, the climate change crisis has worsened on several fronts around the globe. Extreme heat across the United States and Canada has led to hundreds of deaths. Temperatures have hit record levels, and more than 30 million people in the western United States are facing severe heat threats in the coming days. Wildfires are also raging, and the hurricane season is looming. Climate experts say all of this is giving more urgency to the growing climate change threat. We have a great panel for us today, and joining me now from Virginia is Changhua Wu. She is the CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center. With us from Washington, D.C. is Sweta Chakraborty. She is a risk and behavioral scientist and is president of U.S. operations We Don't Have Time. Also joining us from New York is Amali Ta. She is founder and executive director of the NGO Climate Refugees. And also with us from New York is Amy Holmes. She is a writer for HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher and a columnist for the Swiss weekly Die Weltwoche. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Sweta Chakraborty, let me start with you. So far this summer in the Northern Hemisphere, I should say, we've seen record-breaking temperatures. We've also seen extreme weather conditions in other parts of the world as well. What are these severe weather events telling us about the climate crisis?
What we're seeing with these events is what climate scientists have been saying for decades, which is the frequency and probability of events occurring simultaneously will increase, and the intensity of these events at the same time that they're occurring together will also increase. And so it's not surprising that you are seeing these wildfires in the west of the United States, droughts in the southwest, increased likelihood of hurricanes in the east of the United States, increased drought in the Middle East, and increased risk of sea level rise and severe storms in the Pacific. And so all of these things happening simultaneously is unfortunately what we have been predicting for decades, but it's more urgent than ever now to act on it.
Sweta, have we reached some kind of tipping point right now, or could it get worse?
It's still up to us as a global collective what we decide to do, which scenarios we're going to accept. So it can get much worse from here if we don't act urgently and together. And so that's why the Paris Accords 6th-year anniversary coming up this December in Glasgow, called COP26, is going to be so critical. Can we stave off the worst-case scenarios, which will mean the end of the century is habitable for the majority of the people on this planet, or will it be widespread suffering? That's really up to us.
Changhua Wu, looking at conditions in China, China's also been experiencing some severe and extreme weather conditions. I'm looking at a report here that there's been days of rain, very heavy rain in Sichuan province. It's affected more than 120,000 people, caused damage worth up to $27 million. In fact, one city had to evacuate thousands of people. What can you tell us about the conditions that are being experienced in China?
Well, like many other parts of the world, China definitely has been experiencing extreme weather events. And literally this year, southwest part of China is sort of repeating the record level of heavy rainfalls and flooding this year. And last year was literally the record level in decades, which hit much broader regions than in China. And it hits more than dozens of provinces, affecting tens of millions of people, causing even heavier economic losses. And this year, of course, Sichuan is happening now in Sichuan. And the authorities have already warned the people, different regions, that the heavy rainfall will continue and set probably the highest level alert to many parts of the region, particularly along the Yangtze River and also the Yellow River Delta region, the watersheds, because continued heavy rainfall and flooding will potentially threaten more people and causing more severe damages.
Amali Ta, welcome to the show. Extreme weather is also causing a new category of refugees right now. They're known as climate refugees. We're already seeing this in some of the low-lying areas in Africa as well as Central America as well. What can you tell us about how climate change is driving this particular category of refugees right now?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Climate change is certainly contributing to displacement. Right now, we just commemorated World Refugee Day, where 82.4 million people are now forcibly displaced. And climate change is certainly one of those contributing causes, along with conflict and violence. And what you have is, right here, even here in the United States, on its U.S. southern border, you have Central Americans who have been arriving increasingly in record numbers, seeking asylum. And what you have are Central American indigenous farmers fleeing the northern triangle countries of Central America in the dry corridor, where they have been experiencing persistent drought, increasing frequent storms and hurricanes, as you saw last year with Hurricane Eta and Iota, which were categories 4 and 5 storms that devastated the region, upwards of over 4 million people in a year of the COVID-19 pandemic. You have over 1.4 million people that are food insecure per the WFP and FAO. That many people do not become food insecure overnight. That happens over a long and sustained period of time through drought, through rainfall variability, through what I'm describing as climate change. And so what you're seeing are Central America indigenous farmers who are also marginalized, who have experienced human rights abuses, who are oppressed, who do not have land tenure, who do not have the ability to adapt to these conditions. And this is a region that these are not polluting countries. These are not populations that have contributed to global warming. So yes, it is very much internal displacement as well as cross-border displacement.
Right, Amali, how critical is this issue right now? Do governments around the world recognize that we do have this new category of refugees right now, and it seems like the situation is going to get even more critical as we move forward?
Well, it's not actually recognized because a refugee is not someone who is recognized for fleeing situations of climate change. Per the 1951 Refugee Convention, this is not a ground that is protected. That said, we have made some strides in recognizing that climate change is contributing to conditions that force people to flee.
Amy Holmes.
So, yeah.
Okay, Amy Holmes, let's look at the situation here in the United States, the political situation here. Part of the battle here in the United States is the reluctance of very prominent Republicans to acknowledge the severity as well as the threat posed by climate change. I mean, isn't it time for Republicans now to perhaps temper the skepticism and embrace solutions?
Well, any solutions to climate change has to come from the people as a matter of public policy. And I think it might surprise your viewers to learn that the United States is actually the global leader in reducing CO2 emissions. It has been for a number of years. So whatever position Republicans are taking, as a country, the United States is actually leading on this issue. I think it's interesting to hear the discussion about climate refugees, because here in the United States, where we have seen a big population shift, has actually been to one of our lowest lying states, Florida. People have been moving to Florida in droves, particularly over the last year. So clearly there are certain elements of the American voting public that don't see the climate change issue with the same amount of alarmism as some of our other panelists and politicians have been telling us. We also know that a lot of those climate change models early during as this issue was bubbling up were wrong, that they overestimated the degree of climate change, and it was actually much slower and much lower. So as we talk about public policy in addressing this, I think we also have to have some humility and and to understand that there are trade-offs, there are economic trade-offs, and that the public has to be a part of that conversation as to what economic trade-offs they want to make.
Sweta, what are your thoughts on that? Is the United States doing enough?
Well, that's a really good point. This really, despite all of our awareness, knowing that we need to stop oil and gas drilling, for example, there's still more permits being handed out in the United States to drill than even during the Trump presidency. In fact, if we continue on the rate that we're at, the Department of Interior will issue up to 6,000 permits for oil and gas drilling. And that's because of the trade-off that was just described with economic recovery. As we're coming out of the COVID crisis. We're looking at how to speed people forward and to reduce the day-to-day pains that would be increased if gas prices were kept at the rate that we've been seeing. And so here we have oil and gas drilling in the United States, despite knowledge, deep knowledge, that this is harming us as citizens of this shared planet. Mm-hmm. And so this trade-off is something that the U.S. and U.S. citizens and its policymakers will really need to contend with as we move to COP26 and establish the U.S. as a leader in this. Because if we're not doing what we're going to say we're doing at home, how can we expect the countries around the world to follow suit?
And what do you make of Amy's point, Sweta, that despite foot dragging in the United States Congress, the rate of carbon emissions in the United States has in fact been dropping?
That's true. That is still not enough in terms of every single country contributing the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, to ensure that we have a global drop. So we still need to reach the goals that have been set, which is being fully electric, having our electric grid fully renewable by, let's say, 2035, but we can't continue to allow exploitation of natural gas and oil when we know that we are asking other countries to stop doing that, and that's critical for them to be able to meet their NDC goals. Again, we are not part of our own ecosystems here. We are living on a shared planet.
But if I could just jump in here, I think there's a really interesting formulation going on here, that we are asking other countries, despite the fact that we are leading other countries in cutting CO2. Other countries, and this is again where American voters become very frustrated. They see that we're being asked to sacrifice while other developing nations are simply, shrugging their shoulders and shrugging it off. We know coming out of the pandemic that energy usage is going up, it's spiking, which means coal is the cheaper way to get that energy, and that other countries like China, India, and so forth, that they are ignoring all of this climate change discussion for their own economic benefit. So we keep asking Americans to do more and more and more when we're not asking. We shouldn't even be in the position of asking if we're all a part of the global community. And again, American voters also look at the people who are doing the asking, like our Secretary of State, John Kerry, who just bought a beachfront multi-million-dollar vacation home. If he believes that climate change is so dire and so severe, why is he actually buying property that would be underwater by his own estimates, or flying on private jets? A lot of this flies in the face of common sense, and the American voters see it.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Changhua Wu, let's look at the situation in China. Of course, China was one of the main signatories of the Paris Accords. But the Financial Times recently ran an interesting piece. It was an opinion piece, I should say, but that opinion piece recommended that G20 countries try and persuade China to back away from coal-fired power generation. Right now, China gets about 50% of its energy needs from coal. This particular piece in the Financial Times said China should also cancel plans to build even more coal-fired plants. What can you tell us about China's approach to this?
I think the opinion piece definitely has its point. I think that's significant. Then we need to put that in perspective in terms of the timeline. I think short term, that is a worrying situation. Particularly look at the summer. We are talking about severe the heat, droughts, and people have to survive, right? Survive the heat. So you need air conditioning. Suddenly, just the summer now, so far, we've seen dramatic increase of coal consumptions, not only in China, but some other parts of the world, like India, even the United States. Fossil fuel consumption short term this year has been rising because we need to make sure people, have cooling, conditions in order to survive the extreme heat, heavy heat, heat here. So yes, I think that's a good point. Midterm, longer term, I do have enough confidence in China in terms of the shift, the transition from the current heavily still like a coal-based, heavily relying on coal towards cleaner sort of energy, and not only renewable like solar and wind, but also investing deeply in nuclear energy there as well. One point I do want to make, I think Amy has been repeating the point, is that the U.S. is doing a lot, leading. I disagree. I think, yes, if you look at the number now, probably, yes, U.S. has been making efforts to reduce emissions, but we have to look at a historical perspective. because one ton of carbon emitted historically is up there. That's why it's in the atmosphere. That's why we are suffering. Literally talking about severe weather events, refugees, all the losses, the suffering we're talking about here today. So on that particular point, actually, I disagree. In the meantime, from China's side, I do not think China is doing adequate either at this moment. Particularly, China is struggling with the short-term challenges there. So I think, for the country, how quickly we can invest to shift away actually from more and more away from fossil fuel, particularly coal, and shifting towards renewable energy, clean energy. And that's a bigger question on the table the country is trying to address now.
Yeah, but Changhua Wu, how does one fix what has happened in the past? I mean, if there have been excessive emissions in the past, how does one fix that now?
I think that element actually is integrated in the global process. In the Paris Agreement, there's something called the common but differentiated responsibilities there. That is why today, of course, we absolutely need to reduce emissions, absolutely, as soon as possible. But in the meantime, we have to bear in mind actually the legacy burdens there. That's why we're talking low-lying coastal regions, even island nations literally are losing their homelands. And there is a historic legacy we have to deal with.
Amali Tower, we have droughts in Africa and Latin America, which has been feeding into political instability in some of those regions, political unrest and violence as well. In fact, the World Bank estimates that if action isn't taken, we could see up to 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and even in South Asia forced to migrate within their regions by 2050. Question is, what will happen to these people?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, that World Bank study was talking about internal displacement or displacement within their own regions, but that's not and that will primarily be the type of displacement that we're seeing. But I think it's really important to note that by no means minimizes the protection needs that those individuals will have that will continue to go unmet if we don't sort of rise to the occasion and recognize that, this is impacting countries that are already vulnerable to development setbacks, who are already on the fringes of poverty, who are already, dealing with these disproportionate, with the consequences of this disproportionately, having contributed almost nothing in some countries to climate change. So this is this is an issue of justice. And you have countries, rich polluting countries, to some of the conversation that's already been taking place, that have not even kept up with their finance pledges of $100 billion, billion that was supposed to be met by 2020. So, we certainly have a lot of commitments that need to be met. And what will happen to these people is that when people's needs are not met, when they are displaced internally, but their protection needs, their humanitarian needs continue to go unmet, they will move. They will move to wherever they will find help and resources. And if that happens to be across borders, then you will have a situation that requires international protection. And you may have a situation that falls outside the purview of international law right now, but that by no means minimizes that individual's need for international protection. So, you might have a definition issue, but it certainly doesn't take away the philosophical nor the humanitarian needs. And for us to bury our heads in the sand and ignore those realities it really comes down to a lack of political will. But I will say that the Biden administration has, of course, noted this and has incorporated the impacts of climate change on migration within its climate policy and its foreign policy. And on August 3rd, there is an interagency report that is to come out. And we will see what the Biden administration plans to do. And that is the positive and bold and visionary leadership that we do need.
So let me get your view on this. When we talk about the climate refugee issue, I mean, how would it impact countries in Asia? A country like Bangladesh, for instance, and of course there are a lot of island states in Asia as well.
Yes, exactly. And these islands have created an alliance and are really disproportionately speaking up to their size and to the amount they've historically polluted compared to the impacts that they're experiencing. And we need to listen to them carefully and closely because their actual existence is most at risk as compared to any other population or geographic location on the planet. The Maldives is a good example. These are countries that don't need just tens of millions of dollars through the Green Climate Fund and other financing mechanisms that the Paris Accords set up several years ago, but we're talking in the billions to really protect their sovereignty as countries. And again, we have internal displacement, which was just explained. Most people stay within their own country, but how are they going to stay within their own country if their own country ceases to exist? So yes, while we need to think about how we're going to address the urban challenges of displaced people from vulnerable coastlines within their own country, we need to think about physical issues, we need to think about social issues and cultural issues, all of that, of course, but ultimately we need to think about what it's going to look like when there's cross-border migrations much more frequently, because the lower latitudes and places near the equator just are not going to be habitable anymore.
Amy Holmes, I want to get back to something you were talking about earlier on, and that is the sort of delicate balancing act that authorities, governments around the world have to engage in. You know, on the one hand, trying to implement these measures to counter climate change, on the other hand, making sure that these measures don't undermine their economies. There was a recent study, a Swiss study, outlined that G7 countries could lose $5 trillion a year by 2050 if temperatures rise above 2.6 degrees Celsius. I mean, what kind of looming economic disaster could we face then? That's a huge number we're talking about there.
Yes, but you have to look at it in terms of short-term versus long-term. We just heard a panelist say that in the short term, air conditioners need to be running at full blast so that people don't die. That's a real immediate concern that any responsible government would be addressing, and that means more CO2. In terms of the long-term, economic costs, well, 2050 is a long way out. We know that these economic models and climate change models have been flawed and overestimated temperature rises. So when people are trying to make this trade-off, it's difficult because you're talking about the concrete here and now. People literally dying of heat stroke and your economy suffering in the short term versus some hypothetical 15, 20, 30 years away when those hypotheticals we've already seen have been flawed and have overestimated the climate change issue. A lot of this climate alarmism, I think, works against itself because it raises the stakes so high. And then when we don't see these things come to pass, people become very skeptical of what they're hearing from leadership. And again, when we see leadership behaving in ways that would suggest that they don't really take it seriously in their own private lives, when you have climate change conferences around the world where people are flying in on private jets, where they're driving around their host city in huge caravans, people look at this and say, you are asking us to sacrifice, possibly not run our air conditioner and have our grandmother die while you're flying all around the world on private jets. That doesn't make sense, and that indicates that you don't really believe in the science either.
Changhua Wu, if we look at the knock-on effects of climate change and these extreme weather measures, these events that we are talking about, I mean, there's a ripple effect. For instance, we see that droughts are causing a shortage of water. That in turn impacts farmers. Some farmers have had to actually slaughter their cattle because there's not enough water. That pushes up food prices. Is that a preview of what the future is going to be looking like?
We are already living in that kind of reality. It's not to say, that's going to happen in the future. It's already happening. Today, we are dealing with hunger, with food security, food safety, dealing with water scarcity issues, water shortages there. We pretty much, if you look at the news, reading the newspapers, literally everywhere you look around, in somewhere around the world, things already happening there. That's the sense of crisis, actually, we're talking about it here today. I think, back to the scientific foundation or, the basis, actually, for climate change we're talking about here today in terms of sense of urgency, I think the science will continue to have uncertainty. That's the part of the scientists who will continue to invest in it. But I take the side of the sense of urgency. I don't think we are overestimating, the crisis, the sense of crisis today, but rather we are underestimate. Particularly now, if you look at the IPCC, scientific community is looking into now, is seriously looking into the critical threshold, the tipping points, or cascading effects, stuff like that, not only from science, climatic science perspective, but also from reality perspective, because all the things are connected with each other. For humanity, somehow we're just so naive, we don't really understand all of them. That's why we are underestimating the impact, the sense of crisis today.
Molly Tao, you addressed a number of issues earlier on, some of which I don't think we are actually looking at, or at least the world is looking at. On the one hand, there is the science of this, and in that respect, there is a blueprint, there is a plan which is out there. Whether it's being implemented or not is something else. But you mentioned things like the legal side of this. Is that being addressed, the social side of it?
Yes, it is. We do have a framework that is certainly begun to look at this. We have what's called the Global Compact for Migration, and we have the Global Compact for Refugees. That is certainly looking at also environmental degradation and climate change as forces that are contributing towards cross-border migration and displacement. We also have what's called the Platform for Disaster Displacement, which is a state-led initiative, and that came out of something called the Nansen Protection Agenda. So these are UN-led initiatives, and they do provide a framework. And as I alluded to earlier, we also have now, bilateral efforts like the Biden administration now, which through executive order has asked for an interagency report coming out next month to examine what are the impacts of climate change on migration, on displacement, on internal displacement, on cross-border migration, forced displacement, because it's really important that we understand that as well, Anand, that we're not talking about, one driver that forces people across borders. This is a complex issue.
Yeah.
Climate change it contributes to conflict. We have to remember that 70% of the countries that are vulnerable to climate change are also fragile countries. Of the 20 countries or so, where there's conflict present, for example, 8 of those have UN peacekeeping missions present in them, and those countries are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. So these are conditions that, where gains made in terms of conflict can be pushed back as well. So we do have a framework that is looking at this, but it's certainly nothing binding.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thank you for watching.